So as for the next speaker, very proud to present here today. Now that we're talking qualitative data, let's go to the other side of that coin and talk quantitative data with Michele Kiss. Welcome on stage. Yes, so you were also in the UX files, yes?
Yes, the data is out there.
Yeah, the data is out there. Okay, yeah.
Yeah. I put my little skew on there.
Sorry, I didn't get that.
I put my little slant on there.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, so Valerie, she knew the truth, the growth, the data was out there. She didn't really know how to present it, but now we figured out how to do that. But then to actually, the methods of finding that data, that's where we need to know a little bit more, right? And that's what you're going to do.
Exactly, that's where I come in.
Yeah, good luck.
Thanks. All right, so before we get started, probably the main thing that you need to know is that analytics is my thing. I'm not a testing person. I'm not an optimization person. So you're probably wondering, why am I here? What I want to talk about today is how some of the analytics methods that I use every day can help you in your optimization journey and the program that you're running for your own company or for your own clients. So to start off with, analytics should be helping to guide your success metrics. So your knowledge of your business's goals, your key performance indicators, these are the things that should guide your program. And most specifically, your analytics data should be helping you to define the success metric that you're using for an individual experiment. Now, one thing that you might have noticed is that I said metric, singular, one. So a test shouldn't be expected to move 6 different needles at the same time. This is where we want to go back to those key performance indicators and figure out what we're focusing on for a specific test. So a single test shouldn't be expected to somehow increase your rate of purchase, get more people to sign up for emails, and somehow magically also have them all creating a customer account. It's sort of like trying to drive. You need to pick a needle that you're focusing on. So it's not enough to say, oh, well, I'm going to drive because I care about fuel efficiency. You can't do that while zooming around crazy speed like. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't do analysis when you run an experiment and see how it might have affected some of the other key performance indicators or perhaps secondary success metrics on your site. The point is that at the outset, you want to be establishing how you're going to judge success and sticking with it. It also means you can run multiple experiments that have different goals. You probably have a lot of different goals within your business, but you can't expect one test to do all the things. Now, before we get too far into this, I do want to point out that a lot of the data that I work with, and probably a lot of you guys work with, is definitely digital data. So it might be like Google Analytics data or Adobe Analytics data. But when I'm talking about how to better use data for optimization, I'm not confining us there. So there's this adage that if all you have is a hammer, then everything looks like a nail. But the data in your organization can come from a lot of different sources. So you may have advanced form field data available. You might have heat map and scroll tools available. You might have on-site surveys, as Elsa's talked about. You might have qualitative feedback coming from usability tests that you're running. You may even have great customer service data, so what people are telling your call center. All of those are really valuable sources that you can use for optimization. Next, analytics can help us to understand our benchmarks. So before we embark on a test or even start out on a testing program, hopefully you're getting a sense of where your business stands currently. But it's really easy to go into that with this like kind of crazy aggregated view of what your current performance is. So our conversion rate is 2%. Unfortunately, they call it the flaw of averages for a reason. It's sort of like the statistician who drowned in an average of 3 feet of water, or the fact that the average human has 1 breast and 1 testicle. Averages don't always work. So we can look at our conversion rate and we can start out saying like, okay, yeah, it's 2%. But that quickly falls apart. So maybe you start to break it down by device and you see some very different trends. Maybe you look at it by different countries. You look at it across different time periods. When you are using benchmarks, you need to understand what data you're looking at. So what time period have you examined? Did you just pick the last 30 days or the last 90 days or the last 6 months and just kind of choose that? Do you have a sense of the historical context that that data appears in? Do you know that you aren't looking at data that's been somehow skewed by a heavy promotional period? So maybe you go into your experimentation program and you're thinking that you're going to be able to increase conversion from X, and it turns out that was actually an inflated number. So your analytics data can help you to dig into this and to understand more cleanly what your benchmarks actually are before you get started. Your analytics data can also help you to better control the uncontrollable elements of testing. So when we're running a test, our goal is to control as many variables as we possibly can. Because what we want to be able to do is to change one thing and then see if it had an impact. If there are, of course, multiple things changing, then we're not quite sure what's going on. But the one thing that we can't control when we run a test is the time period that we run it in. If you run a test between October 15th and October 30th, that's the time period that it ran in. So a really extreme example of this. If you were to test a new site feature on the biggest shopping holiday of the year, the behavior that you might see from your users and what might win may not be the same as if you were to test it on like June 17th, for example. Another way of saying this is that statistical significance is not enough. When we run tests, there are plenty of sites out there that have enough traffic and enough conversions that they could run tests for a couple of hours, or they could run tests for a couple of days. But we want to ensure that we are testing on a big enough sample of our users that it's actually representative of our users over time. Now, one thing that we talk about a lot is randomization. But I do want to point out one of the challenges that we have in digital testing is that we don't actually randomly sample. We randomly assign people into different variants, but we don't choose when they come to us. We don't say, hey, you in-market car shopper, you're going to come to my website now, and you've been randomly selected to now fall into my A/B test. So if we're not careful, the results that we're getting can be due to our customers and why they chose to come to us at the time they did. So we need to be careful to ensure that we're looking at that correct time period. And to do that, we need to understand the seasonality of our business. Now, there are really basic reports that can point to this stuff without you having to do much work. So even just a basic report in Google Analytics will give you an indication of your daily seasonality, so different hours within the day, because surprise, surprise, most people are not on your website at 2 in the morning, except for maybe if they have jet lag or a 3-year-old. But you can look at this even more cleanly. So if you look at each hour's share of the day, then you're going to see some clear patterns. Weekly, you may have certain days of the week that are more popular for your site than others. And if we were to look at this as, for example, a B2B example, you might see that people are coming to this particular B2B site Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and then on Friday, everybody kind of gets lazy and wants to slide into the weekend. Even yearly seasonality. So your business may have a defined yearly seasonality that you need to be aware of. In this case, this was an automotive site, and they had a really clear kind of seasonal pattern that we saw year after year of when people would come to the site and when people were typically more likely to be in market for a car. And we actually used many, many years of this data to predict the next year and to decide when we would run tests as well as marketing campaigns. Analytics can also help to inform your testing ideas. So in a perfect world, there would be this beautiful cycle, and we'd have a report, and then maybe we would do some kind of analysis, and an opportunity would emerge, and it would be very exciting, and then we'd run a test, and the test would give us some answers, and then we'd maybe do some more analysis, and we'd do it all over again, and that would just be our process, but in reality, it actually kind of looks like this. Now, there's the obvious examples. Looking at different fallout points in your funnel, seeing where there are these big drop-offs and focusing the start of your testing efforts there or your biggest opportunities there. Looking at the form fields that you have on your site, seeing which ones might be required but people aren't necessarily filling them in, and focusing on how you can optimize those. Maybe people are either having to go back to them, spending too long on the field. People are constantly entering the wrong information in there. But there are also more interesting ways that you can use your analytics data. So in this case, this was a B2B client, and they sold a suite of products. And when you purchased the suite, you got everything. So you weren't picking and choosing between them. You just bought the whole thing. And they were looking to move from the US into some emerging markets for them. And what we did was we used their digital data to get an understanding of how popular different products were in these emerging markets compared to the US. So we looked at things like which product pages people viewed, what they clicked when they were on there, what product content they downloaded, what videos they viewed, to get an understanding of how interested people were in each product and possibly how well known it was. And this, when we were then running tests in those countries, allowed us, instead of going into this with this very US-centric lens, like this works here and nowhere else, it allowed us to actually focus on, for example, what product should we lead with in a hero image when maybe some of these products just aren't very well known in those countries. Analytics can also help you prioritize test ideas. So there's, of course, you're going to have a lot of different tests in your organization, and there's a basic way to think about this. How hard is the test to run versus how much money can it make? But the second part of that question can be hard to answer until you've actually run the test and you know if there's an impact or not. So, of course, the analytics person is the person that needs to bring up a spreadsheet. That's just the rules of data. This is a bit.ly link, so it's mkis.me/forecast impact. You do not have to write down everything that I'm about to say because there's a link to a blog post as well as a couple of Google spreadsheets that you can use. So, with that said, I want to walk you through a really, really basic, like not mathy revenue forecast. So I'm going to pretend that I work for an e-commerce site and we have a whole bunch of product images, but we've decided, you know what? We think that we could sell our product better if we actually had videos, sort of like Zappos, who I don't know if they actually exist here, but kittens drop things into your cart, and it's just amazing. So we're going to say, you know what, we're going to try that. And we want to figure out how we should prioritize this test in our queue. So we're going to create a simple forecast. We start by inserting our current data. So we gather information about how much traffic do we get? What percentage of people go to our product pages currently? What percentage of them click an image? So do we have some kind of like image engagement to understand whether people are looking at or using those? For people who click and view images, at what rate do they convert from the product page into the cart? And then we can also look at the overall, like just kind of as a benchmark, how well do people convert from the product page to the cart normally if they're not an image viewer? And then we start layering our assumptions on top of that. So we say, you know what, we're going to assume that there are going to be some people who will be more interested in video. So these people might not have clicked a photo, but they're going to view a video. And so we add them in as like kind of incremental people that we're now going to reach because we have this new functionality on our product pages. And on top of that, we also think that adding these videos is going to increase conversion into the cart from the product page. You can add other placeholders there. You don't necessarily have to use them. In this case, I'm assuming that from cart through to purchase, everything's going to stay the same. So this will get people into the cart, but it's not really going to change anything else downstream. It's not going to change people's average order value, for instance. And you do that, you do a couple tiny calculations, and you have a revenue forecast. So the spreadsheet is available as well as a different one, a kind of different example that you can take a look at your own time. But there's two things that I would recommend with this. One is working with your product managers. So as you're going through this and you're deciding, I think that conversion from the product page to the cart is going to go from 55 to 57%, your product managers are weighing in on that assumption because it is going to be a lot easier to get them to buy into the estimate if they've actually had a hand in some of the assumptions underlying it. You also want to make sure that you're keeping track of the forecast that you come up with versus the actual. This doesn't replace running your test. It's just something to kind of get you started with prioritization. But probably your first one's going to be terrible because, as Val showed, like, we are really bad at guessing things. And this also helps a little bit if you've ever had that product manager who comes to you with a test idea, and every single test idea they tell you about is going to increase conversion by 40%, and they swear, and it never actually does. And you can be like, hey, Chris, remember the last 8 times you told us that? Like, kind of got some evidence here. So let's like temper those assumptions just a little bit. Next, analytics can lend credibility to your testing program. So raise your hands, please. Has anybody doubted their testing tool? I have. So I had a client, several clients, who embarked on some kind of solutions to validate their testing program before they get started. So one of these ways was in running AA tests. So what we would do is run the control versus the control in a number of different countries and a number of times. And part of the reason for this is that this particular client decided that they should do a major domain change and a testing platform change like at the exact same time, and thought that that was like a super good idea. So what we didn't want to do is run a test and say like, hey, we have a winner for something, and it turns out maybe it was super bad data. Now, the thing that we need to keep in mind if you're doing something like this is that if we're talking about 95% confidence, if we were to run the experiment 100 times, 95 times we'll see the same winner, 5 times we'll see a different result. So that means that if we run an AA test, 5% of the time we're going to see a winner of some kind. But we ran one in particular, and we saw some kind of extreme results. So we saw a 60% lift with 99.94% confidence, as Val tells me not to put on a slide. And when we dug into it, what we found was an influx of paid media coming into one of the variants. So essentially, the channel mix between the two variations was not being controlled properly. And so we were able to look at that and to look at the platform and how it was distributing before we actually ran our first test on this new platform, and know that the ones we ran after that were going to be more sound. Another client had some issues of users falling into multiple variations. So this was actually a very engineering-heavy company, and so they decided that instead of buying something, they were just going to build their own testing platform. And we had it running for quite some time on one particular brand of theirs, and a very low rate of people falling into multiple variants. But then they decided they were going to extend it, and they were going to use the same testing platform on another site. So they deployed it to this new brand, and they found that 2% were now seeing multiple variations. And so, of course, if they convert, then what are we going to attribute the success to? So we started digging into the analytics data to understand what was going on, and we found that there was a problem with Internet Explorer, where Internet Explorer was not actually properly keeping people in the version that they were supposed to be in. So we were able to go back to engineering, have them make some revisions with how the platform worked to be able to properly use it. Another client was running a test of a new sign-up flow. So they had a 3-step sign-up flow. It had multiple form fields on each step, and essentially what they did was, it was the same number of form fields, but they blew them all out so that every one was on its own separate page. The problem was that when we went and started testing this, we found that people were going from the old sign-up flow to the new sign-up flow, and from the new sign-up flow to the old sign-up flow. And this was happening for about 2% of sessions and about 5% of their trial sign-ups. And so what we had to do here was revisit the testing methodology that we were using to make sure that this cross-contamination wasn't happening for future experiments. But also this was a very high priority test. So we had like the VP of engineering kind of on our backs on this. So we were able to use our analytics data and take the data separately and start doing analysis on just users who we knew had only been properly exposed to one version of the test. And we were able to get at least some preliminary results until we could get the more robust test up and running. Now, you don't have to have a broken testing platform for this to actually matter. At some point, you encounter situations like this all the time because you can have overlapping test groups. So if you're starting to test, maybe you're not running like a ton at a time, but if you're running a lot of tests, you need to be aware of what is happening if people do fall into overlapping test groups. So for example, if you're running a test on your homepage and on your pricing page, what happens to the user who sees, for example, the control version of the homepage test and the variant of the pricing page test? Now, it might be that you're using a platform that lets you control that at that point and actually not put people into different tests. It might be that you need to sort this out in the data and you need to understand how your data is actually capturing this. So if I come in and I'm in the homepage test, maybe you're setting a dimension with my test ID, but then what happens when I go to the pricing page test? Does that overwrite my test ID? And then how is that attribution taking place? So you need to be aware of this and fully informed in how both your testing platform and your analytics solution are dealing with these to be able to actually use the data. Analytics can also help you to dive deeper into the results that you're seeing. Now, before we get too far down that road, this is not permission to judge your test by anything positive that you can possibly find. We still have to keep in mind what our success metric for the test was. But it can help us to understand the results. So I had a client who conducted a landing page experiment. And the way that this particular business worked is that it was kind of like a service model where your address had to be eligible to even sign up for it. So the first thing that you would do on their landing page was you would go in and you would check your address and find out if you could even buy their service. And so they had this kind of check address CTA on the landing page. It's the main thing that they wanted people to do. They came up with this new landing page. And they actually just wanted to launch it, and we said, hey, can we like maybe test this? That would be great. And they found that it performed worse. So unfortunately, there was actually a lot writing on this particular landing page because they had about six projects that were piggybacked off this that were going to use the new page. And to retrofit all of them for the old page would have been a lot of rework. So everybody was pretty unhappy. So we started looking at our analytics data, and we started comparing various CTAs on the page. So our check address button in the global nav actually performed pretty similarly. And the ones that were in the top of the page performed fairly similarly as well. The problem was the loss of this exposed address bar, I'll call it, where it was really, really clear what we wanted you to do without even having to read like check address. And all we had to do was actually change one of the CTAs back to an exposed address bar. And then we found that performance was actually similar to what we'd seen with the controls. So they were able to move on with the 6 projects they had in the pipe, as well as then continually optimize that page from there. Another client had a really early test. So this was like pretty soon in the start of their program. And, you know, it was great. We ran a couple variants and we found that there was a winner and there was an excited email sent out and everybody prepared a deck and said, this is awesome. And then somebody was looking at the offline data and they're like, I don't know what you're talking about. I'm not seeing any signups like for that variant. I'm not seeing all this awesome conversion rate that you're talking about. And what had happened was that we had bot traffic going into one of the variants, coming from the Philippines, I believe, that was actually signing up for the product. And that had skewed our results. And when we removed that traffic and reran all the analysis, we found that we actually had a totally different winner. Now you might think, wow, that's a super specific and unlikely to occur incident. Unfortunately, it happened again just a couple months later. So this was a site that happened to get hit by a lot of bot traffic, and this was over the course of like The middle of the day, they got a couple of hours of just this heavy hammering of both sessions and signups coming from, in this case, Indonesia. Another client was testing their sign-up flow. So they went from a really long sign-up flow to a single sign-up flow. And pretty much everybody was like, wow, this new sign-up flow is amazing. Oh my God, why isn't it performing better? I don't understand. And, spoiler alert, it was IA, because it's always IA. And in the case of this particular company, they didn't have a lot of clients who used IA. It wasn't super common with their audience. And their developers didn't, and nobody had actually bothered testing the variant. And it didn't function. There were literally 0 conversions on IA. So the moral of the story is that if your spidey sense is tingling and something seems off, you need to dig into it with your analytics data to figure out why you might be seeing the results you're seeing, because maybe things are not as good as they appear. Finally, analytics can help you to test past the online conversion. So online testing is great, but lots of businesses don't operate just online. So one client had a B2B trial to paid model, and what they wanted to do was to increase conversion. What they wanted to do was to actually test a change in the trial length. So they had a 30-day trial. They decided they wanted to test a 14-day trial. And so what we were able to do was to use all of their online data as well as their offline data to see how this converted all the way through, not just to the online sign up, which we could do easily in our testing tool, but all the way through to paid conversion. And we found that there was actually no difference in the conversion to people starting a trial, but we got a 4% increase in conversion to paid. And better yet, for every customer, that in their first year, you would actually get another 2 weeks of revenue out of them as well. Another example, an e-commerce company wanted to fix some of the broken size charts. So I hear that men don't have this problem, like you just say like 32 and then you buy jeans off a shelf and they like somehow magically fit. I don't know how that works. But what they wanted to do was to come up with a better way of figuring out clothes sizes. So they wanted this like clothes calculator that would tell you what size you actually were in the particular brand that you were buying. Now, the goal of this wasn't to increase conversion. They didn't care if conversion was flat. What they wanted to do was to decrease return rate, because returns are expensive and they piss people off when they have to return stuff. So what they were able to do was to use all of that data all the way through to their offline data system to measure this experiment and see if it drove the results that they wanted. And spoiler alert, yes, it did, and the fit calculator is still live. So, are you ready to take your testing to analytics and beyond? And can you tell that I spent a lot of time with a 3-year-old and who likes Toy Story? So, my words of advice. Use your data to help you to find more accurate benchmarks to use for your testing program. Use it to find opportunities for your experiments. Estimate the impact before you run the test. Even a bad estimate is better than that. Run more reliable tests using your analytics data to validate it, and then dig into your results and also take your testing past just the online easy stuff. So this is me, Twitter, email, Measure, chat. If you happen to be an analytics inclined person, it's about a 10,000 person analytics Slack community. So you're welcome to join us at join.measure.chat, and I will be around if anybody has any questions besides now.